You know, when we try to picture a global financial fracture, we usually look for the classic warning signs.
Right, the cinematic stuff.
Exactly, like traders shouting across the floor of the stock exchange or,
Yeah.
chaotic red tickers scrolling across the screen, maybe a run on a physical bank with lines around the block.
The familiar imagery of a panic. It's what we've been trained to expect on the evening news.
But what if the real warning signs look completely different? Like, what if they are entirely invisible to the average person? Ask yourself this. What do a $286 barrel of oil in Sri Lanka, a Chinese cold chain infrastructure default, and the stablecoins sitting in your digital crypto wallet all have in common?
On the surface, absolutely nothing.
Right.
But if you actually look at the underlying plumbing of the global economy, they are symptoms of the exact same structural failure.
And that failure is exactly what we are exploring in this deep dive. Welcome in. Today, we are pulling from a fascinating dispatch published in May 2026 on a Substack called Janus The Watcher.
Yeah, great piece.
The piece is titled The Forced Buyer and the Kill Switch. And our mission today is to map out this author's brilliant and frankly kind of alarming architectural analysis of the global financial system. We're going to unpack how a hidden fracture in the global US dollar market is colliding with a brand new piece of crypto regulation called the Genius Act.
And how this collision might literally be building a 247 financial kill switch.
Which sounds wild. Now, it is crucial to note right at the start that we are analyzing the mechanics here. This touches on U.S. policy, global trade, highly charged regulatory debates.
Yeah, very charged right now.
But we aren't taking any political sides today. Both sides have strong opinions, but we are simply reporting on the author's work, following the money and the math to understand how the system is actually wired.
Just looking at the architecture.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start with the symptom before we can diagnose the disease. The author argues that the U.S. dollar, which is, the universal denominator of the global economy, has secretly become tiered. And to prove this, they point to a really crazy week in April 2026. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent is testifying under oath, and he just casually confirms that American allies in the Gulf and Asia are quietly requesting emergency dollar swap lines.
Which he phrased as a necessary step to prevent disorderly sales of U.S. assets.
Hold up, let's define that before we go any further. I hear swap line thrown around on financial news all the time, but what exactly are these foreign allies asking for? Like, what is it?
Okay, think of a swap line as a massive emergency credit card issued directly by the Federal Reserve to a foreign central bank.
Okay.
When a foreign country desperately needs U.S. dollars to keep its own banking system afloat, the Fed will literally swap newly printed dollars for that country's local currency. It's a crisis tool.
So allies are asking for crisis tools.
No.
And then in that exact same week, the Saudi finance minister, Mohammed Al-Jadaan, stands up at the IMF spring meetings.
Yeah, I remember this.
He tells a room full of central bankers that the $90 oil price they see on their screens is a total fiction. He says real physical barrels are actually costing buyers anywhere from $120 to $160.
Yep.
And if that isn't wild enough, the CEO of HSBC reports seeing oil delivered to Sri Lanka for a staggering $286 a barrel.
The author uses this to show the ultimate disconnect between the published benchmark and physical reality. You have the world's largest oil exporter and the U.S. Treasury Secretary both essentially confirming that the dollar system is fracturing into different realities.
Let me try an analogy here to see if I'm tracking. It's like looking at the sticker price for a concert ticket online. The website says it's $50.
Right, face value.
You think, great, it's $50. But when you actually try to buy it, the system errors out. The only way you can actually get into the building is to go through a scalper in the alleyway, and suddenly you are paying 3 times the price.
Depending entirely on who you are.
Exactly. Depending on who you are and where you live, the official benchmark is just completely disconnected from the reality on the ground.
What's fascinating here is the underlying mechanism driving this disparity. The author describes it as the Cantillon geography.
Oh, right.
Historically, the Cantillon effect was a theory about time. It meant that whoever gets newly printed money first benefits the most, before inflation causes prices to adjust for everyone else.
The people closest to the printer.
It was about when you get the money.
Yeah.
But the author argues that today it's about where you are geographically.
And the dispatch ties this to the fact that the U.S. flipped from being an oil importer to a net exporter of crude oil, right? They mentioned this hasn't been the case since, 1943?
Yes, 1943. And that is the key to the plumbing here. Think about how oil is paid for globally.
Always in dollars.
Universally priced and settled in U.S. dollars. In the past, when the U.S. was a massive net importer of oil, we physically sent billions of U.S. dollars out into the global economy to buy that foreign oil. We were essentially spraying global markets with dollar liquidity.
We were lubricating the global system.
Precisely.
Yeah.
But today, the U.S. is selling oil to the rest of the world. So when Japan or Europe buys American oil, they have to scrape together U.S. dollars from their local economies and send them back to America.
Oh, wow.
It acts as a massive vacuum. Every single barrel of oil sold abroad pulls dollars out of foreign markets and funnels them straight back into the U.S. settlement system.
So the further away you are from the core of the U.S. dollar system, the more expensive it becomes to find the actual dollars you need to buy basic necessities, like energy.
Exactly. Which brings us to how the author maps this out into 3 concentric rings of dollar access.
Let's go through those.
So ring 1 is the inner circle. The UK, the Eurozone, Japan, they have direct standing swap lines with the Federal Reserve. They are basically sitting right next to the printer, so they pay the normal managed price for dollars.
Okay, that makes sense. Then you have ring 2. This is most of the OECD countries and the Gulf monarchies. Usually they do fine. But right now, according to the piece, they are under extreme stress.
Very stressed.
The author highlights that the UAE Central Bank actually had to ask for a US dollar swap line and even threatened to pivot to the Chinese yuan if they couldn't get one. But I want to push back on that for a second. The UAE is incredibly wealthy. They pump massive amounts of oil. Why would they be begging for US dollars?
Well, because wealth in oil doesn't automatically translate to liquid US dollars during a banking squeeze.
Yeah.
If they can't access dollars smoothly through normal market operations, because of that vacuum effect we just talked about.
The banks freeze up.
Right, their banks freeze up. Ring 2 allies asking for emergency access like this is a massive red flag.
And then there is ring 3, frontier markets, Sri Lanka, Egypt, Argentina. They don't have swap lines at all. They're completely exposed to the elements.
They're on their own.
Yeah. They are the ones paying the chaotic, exorbitant prices like $286 for a single barrel of oil. But let me stop and ask the obvious question. If you are listening to this right now, earning your paycheck in a local town, why should you care if Sri Lanka is paying more for oil or if the UAE wants a swap line?
You should care because the US dollar is the underlying ruler measuring your entire economic reality. I mean, it measures the value of your groceries, your house, your retirement fund. If that ruler starts bending, if a dollar means something fundamentally different depending on where you are on the map,
And then prices everywhere get distorted.
then every price in the world becomes a guess. The very foundation of global trade begins to wobble.
And it's not just trade either. It's the investments holding the economy together. The author calls this the collateral fiction. We are seeing this breakdown in private credit markets right now.
Yeah, the Met Cold situation.
Right. In April 2026, BlackRock's Asia Pacific Private Credit Fund reported a $27.5 million unpaid principal default on a Shanghai-based cold chain infrastructure provider called Met Cold Holdings.
And the nature of this default is the real signal here. Met Cold is a local business. They sell cold storage space in Shanghai. Their revenues come in their local currency, the yuan. But their liabilities, the debt they owe to this BlackRock fund, are denominated in US dollars.
So wasn't that the cold chain business suddenly went bankrupt because they lost customers? It was a denominator fiction default.
Exactly.
Let me see if I have this right. They were probably making the exact same amount of yuan every month. But because U.S. dollars became so scarce and expensive to acquire locally due to that Cantillon geography vacuum, the cost of paying back their dollar debt just skyrocketed.
You've got it. The underlying business was likely perfectly stable, but the ruler they used to measure their debt suddenly stretched. As long as the dollar is stable globally, this gap is completely invisible.
But the second the global dollar supply squeezes, that fiction breaks.
It shatters.
Okay, so we have established this massive global squeeze for dollars. And that pressure leads us straight back to the U.S. Treasury market. The author cites a major warning from former Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson.
And this is where it gets scary for policymakers.
Yeah. He explicitly warned about a scenario where you hit a wall, you try to issue U.S. Treasuries to fund the government, and the Federal Reserve is the only buyer showing up in the room.
A scenario that is terrifying for any government that relies on continuous debt issuance to keep the lights on.
The pressure signals are definitely flashing red. In April 2026, the Treasury held a $15 billion debt buyback. And the author notes it was oversubscribed by 2.67 times.
We need to decode what that actually means.
Jeez.
When the Treasury offers to buy back $15 billion of its own older debt, and investors offer them almost $40 billion worth instead, it means current holders of U.S. debt are desperate for an exit. I mean, they want out of those bonds.
And at the exact same time, the piece notes the Treasury is bleeding $166 billion in tariff refunds because of a recent Supreme Court ruling. So here's where it gets really interesting. If the world is starved for dollars and current investors are practically trampling each other to get out of U.S. Treasuries, and the government is losing billions in unexpected refunds, who in the world is going to buy all the new government debt?
That question is the absolute core of the author's thesis. The government needed a captive audience. They needed a forced buyer. And they found one, hiding in plain sight, through crypto regulation.
The Janus Act.
Passed in July 2025 and fully operational by July 2026.
Let's look at how this was presented to the public. On paper, the Janus Act was sold as this great, prudent safety measure for the crypto industry. It mandates that any compliant U.S. dollar stablecoin, those digital tokens designed to always be worth exactly $1,
Right.
must be backed 1-to-1. And what are they legally allowed to hold as backing? Only U.S. dollars, short-term U.S. treasuries, or government money market funds. That's it. Nothing else.
And Standard Chartered Bank ran the projections on this mandate. They estimate that by 2028, this single piece of regulation will create between $800 billion and $1 trillion of incremental demand for U.S. Treasury bills.
$1 trillion of guaranteed demand.
Yes.
Imagine a struggling local restaurant that just can't get enough customers to keep the lights on. The food isn't selling. So the town council passes a municipal ordinance mandating that all local tech startups must cater their daily office lunches exclusively from that specific restaurant. The council cites workplace food safety standards as the reason.
Well, it's a brilliant move for the restaurant. It solves their demand problem instantly.
Boom. Guaranteed daily revenue. They don't have to compete for it. The startups are legally forced to buy the food or they get shut down by the town. That is exactly what the Janus Act did for the U.S. Treasury. It created a legal mandate that forces crypto companies to absorb the debt that traditional investors are desperately trying to sell.
The reflexivity of this design is fascinating. But it is incredibly fragile. The U.S. government desperately needs buyers for its debt. The Janus Act forces stablecoin issuers to be those buyers. The stablecoins, in turn, need the public to trust them. And that trust is underwritten by the fact that they hold safe U.S. government debt.
But the only reason that debt holds its value in a market desperate to sell is because a massive chunk of the demand is now legally mandated from the stablecoins. It's a completely closed loop.
And as the author points out, a loop that stabilizes itself by running forward under normal conditions will violently unwind itself by running backward under stress.
So if the government is basically using crypto regulation to force stablecoins to buy its debt, what happens when those stablecoin users want their cash back all at once? I mean, they're holding a massive bag of U.S. debt. According to the author, the Janus Act has effectively built a shadow banking system because structurally, a stablecoin is now just a money market fund or an MMF.
Except they are operating without any of the safety nets that actual money market funds have. I mean, after the 2008 financial crisis, regulators built massive walls around traditional MMFs. They established SEC Rule 2A7, they implemented redemption gates, they enforced floating net asset values. Stablecoins don't have any of that.
Wait, let's translate that for a second. Our redemption gate means a traditional fund can literally lock the doors and say, no, you can't have your money today to stop a panic.
Exactly.
And stablecoins legally can't do that.
Correct. They promise instant on-demand redemption 24/7. They don't fall under Rule 2A7, which mandates strict liquidity buffers. And most importantly, they have zero access to the Federal Reserve's emergency liquidity windows.
Now, a lot of people listening might immediately think of Silicon Valley Bank collapsing in 2023, but the author argues that is the wrong comparison.
Completely wrong.
SVB collapsed because they held long-term bonds that lost value when interest rates went up. It was a duration mismatch. Stablecoins hold short-duration bills. They don't have that risk. Their risk is settlement liquidity.
I'm really glad you brought that up. Settlement liquidity means you need cash right now to hand to a customer, but you can't access it.
Hold on, I'm trying to wrap my head around this. You're saying their risk is settlement liquidity. But U.S. Treasuries are widely considered the safest, most liquid asset on the planet. How does holding the safest asset in the world trigger a collapse?
Because even the safest asset needs a functioning secondary market to be turned into actual cash. Imagine a scenario like March 2020. A massive global panic hits, and the secondary market for U.S. Treasuries just freezes. Even government debt goes bidless. No one is buying.
Wow.
If a stablecoin issuer is facing a wave of users trying to cash out, they have to sell their treasuries to get that cash. But if the market is frozen, they can't sell.
And unlike a real bank, they can't just call up the Federal Reserve and use the discount window to hand over their treasuries in exchange for an emergency cash loan.
Precisely. The peg breaks. Not because they don't have the assets, but because they simply cannot turn those assets into cash fast enough. The historical precedent here isn't SVB. It is the Reserve Primary Fund in 2008.
Right, the MMF that broke the buck.
Exactly. When Lehman Brothers collapsed, the Reserve Primary Fund held their commercial paper. Panic set in. Investors demanded their money back. The fund couldn't liquidate its holdings fast enough, and the fund dropped to 97 cents.
And the contagion from that single fund breaking spread through the entire sector. Hundreds of billions of dollars evaporated.
But here is the critical difference between 2008 and today. A traditional bank run, or a mutual fund run, takes days to unfold.
Yeah, the author writes something chilling here. A bank run takes days. A stablecoin run takes blocks, meaning blockchain blocks. We are talking about digital speed, a collapse that happens in minutes or hours.
What stopped that 2008 panic wasn't the free market sorting itself out. It was the government stepping in within 72 hours, using emergency facilities created out of thin air. The main tool they used was the Exchange Stabilization Fund, or ESF. They use it to backstop the money market funds and restore confidence.
Okay, let me play devil's advocate here. If the government did it in 2008, couldn't they just do that again? Couldn't they just deploy the ESF to bail out a crashing stablecoin and stop the panic?
Well, and if we connect this back to the beginning of our discussion, you will see the structural trap. Remember Secretary Bessent's testimony about the UAE and the swap lines? Bessent explicitly stated that the Exchange Stabilization Fund is currently tied up being deployed to manage those foreign swap lines.
I see. So the fire extinguisher is currently being used in another building.
Exactly. The U.S. is actively spending its only existing rescue tool.
Yeah.
The exact tool needed to stop a domestic stablecoin panic on managing geopolitical brush fires abroad to keep allies from dumping U.S. assets. The tool is spoken for.
Wow.
The kill switch isn't a metaphor. It is an operational reality.
So we have this massive vulnerability built into the system. Let's look at how a failure would actually play out, because not all stablecoins are built the same way. The author breaks them down into three archetypes of failure. First, you have Tether, or USDT.
Right. Tether is an offshore issuer based in the British Virgin Islands. They have no standing U.S. facility, no implicit federal backstop. If a run happens there, resolution is just whatever a BVI offshore insolvency court produces. It would be entirely chaotic.
Then you have USDC, run by Circle. They are deeply embedded in the U.S. banking system. They have huge institutional relationships.
Which means they have an implicit backstop. Their banking partners have access to the Fed. During a crisis, that access might be informally shared to save them. It's not a formal legal guarantee, but it is a bridge to safety that the offshore companies simply do not have.
And then there's the third archetype, which the author brings up using RLUSD, issued by Ripple. This one is supervised by the New York Department of Financial Services under Part 200. It's architecturally much closer to a traditional, highly supervised money market fund.
It has rigorous, high-quality supervision. But here is the catcher's coat. The author emphasizes, supervision is not resolution.
Okay, explain that.
If that entity actually breaks during a panic, it still has to go through standard bankruptcy courts in New York. There is no federal rescue facilities specifically designed to catch it.
So it's three different architectures, but the same terrifying destination if the system seizes up and there's no lender of last resort. So what does this all mean for you, the person listening to this right now? The author makes it chillingly clear. If a regional bank fails, the damage is generally contained. It's trapped in FDIC claims and wholesale funding markets. It's bad, but it has walls around it.
But if a major stablecoin fails, the contagion doesn't stay in the banking sector. It instantly freezes every merchant that accepts it. It severs every cross-border remittance corridor that immigrants rely on to send money home.
It rips through every decentralized finance protocol that uses that stablecoin as a foundational building block.
Exactly. It's a structural crisis baked directly into the 247 global payment rails.
Now, as an analyst, I know you appreciate that the author isn't just shouting doom into the void here. They clearly outline how this entire thesis is falsifiable.
Yes, which is the mark of good architectural analysis. They lay out exactly how we would know if this threat is actually fading. If we see those benchmark spreads converge in the next 6 months, meaning if that $286 barrel of oil in Sri Lanka drops back down to match the $90 screen price, the pressure is easing. Or if regulators suddenly grant these stablecoin issuers actual formal access to federal liquidity facilities.
If they actually give them the safety net they need.
Right. If those things happen, the threat level drops significantly. But until then, we're looking at a system precariously balanced on a forced buyer mechanism, while the safety net is deployed halfway across the world.
It really forces a massive rethink of what a safe asset actually is in this environment. If the underlying ruler, the dollar itself, is subject to these geographical pressures, and the institutions are trapped in a legal loop of forced buying, you almost have to look outside that closed loop for true stability.
And that is exactly where the author leaves us, a final, lingering concept to ponder. They write that if the current system relies on a unit controlled by an actor who is fundamentally incentivized to devalue it, meaning a government that needs to inflate away its massive debt, then the ultimate exit filter has to look completely different from traditional finance.
They argue it requires an asset with a fixed supply, borderless settlement, sub-second finality, and most importantly, no printer.
Assets that sit outside the Cantillon geography entirely. The author points to Bitcoin, or historically, gold. The specific asset matters less than the structural filter it provides. You need something that doesn't have a kill switch built in by a desperate fiscal authority.
So as you go about your week and you watch the global prices of oil shift and you see the value of the dollar move in the news, ask yourself a question. We started by looking at foreign trade imbalances and complex crypto regulations, but the game has fundamentally changed. If the traditional financial rails, and even the new stablecoin rails, have a structural kill switch built in, what does a truly borderless, printer-free safe haven look like in your own life?
It's a question we might all need an answer to sooner rather than later.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We'll be watching the markets, the block explorers, and those global oil shipments right alongside you. Stay curious, and we'll catch you next time.